This week on the Lectures in History podcast, Boise State University history professor Jill Gill examines Martin Luther King Jr.'s political strategies during the Civil Rights Movement. She looks beyond King's role as a moral leader to explore how he built coalitions, used nonviolent protest, and pressured political leaders to advance civil rights legislation, from the Montgomery bus boycott through the years leading up to his assassination in 1968. More after this.
Well, let's get started. So, gang, we were talking about on Monday how making systemic change on really tough old issues like racial discrimination is super duper tough. And we were looking at different kinds of tactics and strategies that people were trying to make change in the middle part of the 20th century. We did Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We talked about the NAACP. We've talked about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? Martin Luther King is going to settle on a fairly successful strategy, kind of his winning strategy, because he's going to accomplish something that people, had been kind of left on the back burner for, since Reconstruction, trying to get the 14th and 15th Amendments enforced. Remember, the federal government was laying off those after Reconstruction was abandoned. And so he's going to come up with a winning strategy to get the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 passed. And those are the things that basically where the federal government is saying, we're going to try to go back and enforce kind of the heart of those amendments. So it was a big victory. And we're going to talk about his winning strategy. And that strategy, when he accomplishes those things, he's going to be at his peak of popularity. Here he is, Time Magazine Man of the Year in 64. He also wins the Nobel Peace Prize for what he accomplishes. But then here's the puzzle we want to crack today. He lives 3 more years after that. And after that, his strategy begins to falter for him. He starts getting frustrated. By the end of his life, when he's assassinated in April of 1968, his popularity is somewhere between 25 and 28%. And he's in a bit of a depression. His strategy stops working. And we're going to come back around too at the end because Malcolm X, who is operating in the North, is also kind of coming up against the same kind of barriers. So let's see if we can figure out why his strategy works so well and why it falters at the end. Okay? Because that's why you have other folks in the late 60s trying to crack this nut as well. All right. So let's do a little bit of review from where we were on Monday. Just for our C-SPAN friends, we got to catch them up a little bit, right? So we talked about when King was a young man in college and seminary, he was picking up influences of how to make social change. We talked about 3 influences on him. Let's go through them real quick. You can shout them out so you can stay anonymous, okay? Who's the first one that we did? The guy from India. Gandhi, very, very good. Nonviolent civil disobedience and real savvy use of the media, right? Where you sacrifice. If you're trying to change things, you don't cooperate with your own repression. But then when the British Empire is going to then use violence to force you, you're basically suffering on camera when they do that. And you're trying to win the empathy, the sympathy of the viewers so that your group is framed as kind of the good guys in this moral drama. And the people who are repressing you are the bad guys. You really need media to help you frame that. And he was really good at that. Okay, good. Second guy, he was a friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thoreau, thank you very much. So Thoreau was the abolitionist who was against the Fugitive Slave Act. And he had a boycott going, a one-person boycott to not pay his taxes, right? And then he's going to write this essay called On Civil Disobedience. And that is going to captivate King because he says in there, the only proper place for a just man in an unjust society is in jail. So King is going to think, okay, we can use boycotts. And if we fill the jails with just people, not only are we putting pressure on the system so that if they can't arrest more people, they're going to have to negotiate. But the other thing is it kind of frames where justice lies. If the just people are in the jail and the unjust people are outside of the jail, then where is the law, right? Is the law a good law or bad law? Okay, third influence. Jesus. Good. Thank you. Yeah, because he went to seminary. And so from Jesus, you've got to turn the other cheek guy, also nonviolence. But he broke some rabbinic laws, right? He got the Pharisees on the, right? He upset the Pharisees a little bit. He's going to upset the power structure. And when he was asked about that, he said, well, there's God's laws and there's man's laws. If you love your God with all your mind, soul, and strength, you love your neighbor as yourself. If you've got a human law that violates that, then you can break it to follow those higher laws. And so Jesus did. And if you do break a law, you then have to pay the penalty, the civil penalty. And for Jesus, that meant crucifixion. For King, it's going to mean death. And he knew that. He knew that. But he's committing himself to these. Okay, good. Thank you. So those are our influences. Now, we also have to set King into the context of the Cold War. And we've talked about this as well. This is review for us. How did the Cold War and World War II make racism a foreign policy issue, right? How did it make racism a foreign policy issue? Yeah.
And is it Russia? They used it as a propaganda kind of thing.
Yes.
So it's like if they don't believe in that, then we shouldn't believe in that if they believe in it.
That's right. It becomes a propaganda thing where the Russians are basically saying, hey, you countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East that are freeing yourselves from colonialism, don't join the American team, because look for people who look like you in that so-called free country called the United States. Are you, because you're not white, getting all that freedom and democracy? The Soviets are using that as propaganda to basically hurt America's image as the leader of the free world, okay? And America needs to keep its image up as the leader of the free world in order to be able to win the Cold War. Even, we showed this one. Truman, he was told by his State Department that if America doesn't do better cleaning up its image with respect to race, then we're probably going to lose the Cold War, because other countries of color are not going to believe us, and they might try what the Soviets are offering. So he says, right, the treatment in which our Negroes receive is taken as a reflection of our attitude toward all dark-skinned peoples. Plays into the hands of the propagandists, as you said, right? The United States is not so strong that we can ignore what the world thinks of our record. So King is playing into that as well. And then we talked about A. Philip Randolph a few weeks ago. He is really a master strategist too. And he's the one that figures out how to leverage this Cold War thing into an actual social change strategy. And what you've got to do, remember, the presidents of this era are almost held hostage by the Solid South. The Dixiecrats in Congress control the big committees. And a president had a hard time getting any legislation passed if those Dixiecrats, those Southerners, won't go along with that president. So you can't touch race if you want them to cooperate with you. So how do you peel the president off of that? A. Philip Randolph basically said to presidents, he said this to Roosevelt and then Truman, if you don't desegregate the wartime industries, Mr. Roosevelt, I've got 100,000 black men that are going to march on Washington, D.C., and we're going to show our dirty laundry on race in front of the news cameras. He did the same thing with Truman. And it was able to peel the president off, because presidents have to win the Cold War. They have to win World War II. They have to win the Cold War. They've got to keep the international coalition together. They were willing to sacrifice the happiness of the Solid South to do those bigger things. So Martin Luther King is going to master that strategy, all right? But we want to give credit to old A. Philip Randolph. Okay, now, King's winning strategy. It encompasses all of that. But he also, like Gandhi, he has to have a friendly national media to portray the morality play that he's trying, the truth of how black people were experiencing life, out to the rest of the country and out to the rest of the world. National media. Let's think about, you've got television. He's going to get stuff on television. We have satellite television by the early 60s, so you can bounce images all around the world like that. ABC, NBC, CBS. Those are the big three channels, right? Where are they located geographically? And they're still there today. If you watch the Today Show in the morning, where do they report from?
The East, right?
What's that?
Is it the East Coast?
Yeah, it's the East Coast, and I heard it. New York? Yeah, Rockefeller Center, right? So the national media is the northern media. The northern media is the national media. And the North has its own narrative about itself with respect to race. It has its own kind of innocence narrative, but it comes out of the Civil War, that the North, went down and beat the Confederates and freed African Americans from their enslavement. And so to portray the civil rights movement of the South in a friendly way is easier for Northern national media to do because it already fits a comfortable narrative. Those Confederates, I've never admitted they lost the Civil War. And so King is kind of counting on that the Northern media and the national media will be friendly to his cause, right? Okay, very, very good. He also needs, as we said on Monday, Northern white allies, white people of goodwill, to give of their time and of their money to help the movement. Black people are about 12% of the population, and it's expensive. You have to earn bail money. You have to raise bail money to get people out and transport people. And so there's a lot of white people who he'd give 200 speeches a year in the North. They'd write him checks, and then he'd use that to fund the campaign, okay? So that's all his strategy. Now, I call it the pig pile strategy. Because what he's really trying to do, the South, and this is how the presidents felt, it was the South that was the most egregious region of the country on race. We know that the North had Jim Crow too. We've done Idaho. They had segregated housing and some places in schools and other things, right? Job discrimination. But the way the North did it was hard to get on camera. They did it through de facto methods, and we'll talk about that. But the South was so blatant with the massive resistance. That was part of their strategy. They do it by de jure. And it was the South that was giving America a bad look in the eyes of the world. So King is putting pressure on the South. He's isolating the South. And I think a lot of civil rights advocates thought if you could change the most egregious part of the country, it would ripple across the rest. A lot of Northerners came down to help the Southern movement because they thought it would ripple, okay? So he's got Northern pressure, those Northern people of goodwill, and the Northern media pushing from the top. They're trying to get international pressure onto the president to protect America's image, and you've got a squeeze play, okay? All right. So let's watch how this happens in action. King is going to really show his peak of brilliance in the Birmingham campaign of 1963. So, Birmingham, Alabama, was nicknamed Bombingham because there were so many Ku Klux Klan bombings of Black churches and other buildings. It was a very violent city. It was deeply segregated. And the police chief there was this guy up in the right corner. That's Police Chief Bull Connor. He was an ardent segregationist, and he was always smack-talking the civil rights movement, saying, yeah, those civil rights are coming to my town, right? And you may recognize his name because that's the guy that arrested Senator Glenn Taylor of Idaho back in 1948 when he walked through the quote, colored entrance of a building on purpose in front of these guys, and they arrested him, threw him on the ground, tore his shirt. That's the same police guy, okay? So King is coming down here, and he's going to use this combination strategy. They've got a boycott, so they've got a throw-in boycott going. They're using nonviolent civil disobedience. And they're going to fill the jails because when they start marching, right, and they're doing their boycott, Bull Connor is going to come and arrest them for blocking traffic or whatever and throwing them in jail, okay? He's going to try to put pressure on the system. Now, this gets going just fine. He's got the adults marching in their Sunday school best clothes. They're carrying American flags. They're doing their boycott. And at first, Bull Connor kind of surprises King. He stays fairly nonviolent, and he's just arresting people and putting them in the paddy wagon. And the media is starting to get bored because you can only show that so many times. And so the media is kind of flagging off a little bit. And then he runs into a second problem. The adults that are marching, they got to go to work on Monday. They can go to jail maybe on Thursday or Friday, but they can't miss work. They got bills to pay. They got kids to feed. And so they're saying, King, I got to be out by Monday morning. I got to go to work. You got to bail me out. So he's running through his bail money, and it looks like this thing might fail. And then one of his, Martin Luther King's staff, his lieutenants, says, you know the kids want to march? They're already on the front line of this battle. They're already putting their lives on the line to segregate the schools, which was a violent encounter. We've seen the footage of Little Rock, right? And their lives are on the line. Their futures are on the line. They feel the urgency of now. Their parents' and grandparents' lives are already set. But if you can get desegregation, they can dream. They can have fully participatory American dream kinds of lives. So they are more committed, maybe in some sense, than their parents. They want to march. And they can hold a place in jail just like their parent, but they don't have to get let out of jail because, yeah, they'll miss some school. But they're not going to hurt the family's income, right? So King says, good, okay, let the kids march. And the kids start marching, doing the same thing that their parents did. And for whatever reason, it's that moment that Bull Connor snaps. He loses his cool, and he brings out the police dogs and the fire hoses to attack the kids. These are big, burly, strong police officers and firefighters attacking kids from the age of 6, you'll see some like little first graders, up to high school, okay? And the water pressure, this isn't like your old garden hose. The fire hoses can blow 100 pounds of pressure per square inch. That can knock the legs right out from under a child and snap their bones, that kind of force. And people are seeing this on their evening news. There was one scene, I'm going to show you a video clip of this so you can put your own eyes on this. They're going to be talking about a scene where a little girl, I don't know, she's maybe 3rd grade or something. She gets hit in the legs with the fire hose and it flips her in the air. She crashes down on the pavement and then they use their fire hose like a pressure washer. And they're just rolling that little girl down the street with leaves and dirt and bottles and so on. And they're just rolling her like she's street trash. And the whole world is watching this on satellite television, okay? So let's watch it. You guys see for yourselves, and then we're gonna talk about it, okay? And you're gonna see a guy at the end of this, Governor George Wallace of Alabama. You read about him in Meacham. You're gonna hear him at the end. So let's pull up our first clip. Okay, here we go. And you can see the ages of the kids. This is Eyes on the Prize. Footage from Eyes on the Prize.
There is nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to turn me around. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do to turn me around.
By the end of that Thursday, 700 children were taken to Birmingham jail.
All on my way, oh Lord, freedom land.
Friday, more than 1,000 children stayed out of school and arrived at the 16th Street Church to march. Bull Connor tried to stop the marches before they began and brought out the city's police dogs. Next, the fire department was brought in and Bull Connor ordered water hoses turned on the demonstrators. With 100 pounds of pressure per square inch, the water hit with enough force to knock the bark off trees. As water pounded the demonstrators, David Vann was on the phone with A.G. Gaston.
And he was expressing a great deal of resentment about King coming in and messing up the thing just when we were getting a new start. And then he said to me, he said, but Lawyer Vann said, they've turned fire hoses on a little black girl. They're rolling that little girl right in the middle of the street now. I can't talk to you no more.
It was it and stand up on my building looking down on Bull Connor and them shooting water in the park right across from my office there in that park. I guess that's the most outstanding thing in my mind right now. I just couldn't imagine what could happen.
Bull Connor's white tank patrolled the city streets as the fire hoses stopped the demonstrators. Some hid behind the trees of Kelly England Park. Others frolicked in defiance. The conflict gained national attention, and news coverage of the event shocked the American public.
And it was a masterpiece of the use of media to explain a cause to the general public of a nation. Because in those days, you had 15 minutes of national news and 15 minutes of local news. And in marching only one block, they could get enough news film to fill all of the newscasts of all of the television stations in the United States.
Photographs appeared in newspapers throughout the world, and the Birmingham story was told in many languages. The Russian newspaper Pravda ran a cartoon of police intimidating a black child. The federal government worried about America's image in other parts of the world. Governor Wallace saw it differently.
It seems that other parts of the world ought to be concerned about what we think of them instead of what they think of us. After all, we're feeding most of them. And whenever they start rejecting 25 cents of each dollar foreign aid money that we send to them, then I'll be concerned about their attitude toward us. But until they reject that 25 cents out of each dollar that Southern taxpayers pay for foreign aid to these countries, I will never be concerned about their attitude. In the first place, the average man in Africa and Asia doesn't even know where he is, much less where Alabama is.
Oh, how wrong he was. Let me show you, gang.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Governors don't have to protect America's image in the eyes of the world. It's not the job of a governor to win the Cold War. But gang, this is the Easter season of 1963. This is mere months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The peak of the Cold War is at the highest pitch it had almost ever been, right? The United States and Russia almost went to war with each other in the October of '62. So the stakes are really high. And frankly, gang, Wallace was wrong. And I can show it to you. I can prove it to you. I'm going to show you some documents that the State Department collected that I've given you on your Canvas site. So you guys can read these whole documents if you want to. I'm going to read part of them to you. When I was doing research on the Vietnam War for my doctoral thesis, I was in the State Department papers looking at international affairs stuff, studying 1963 and the build-up to Vietnam. And I stumbled across these folders, about 3 or 4 of them, big, thick folders with hundreds of pages each that were marked Birmingham. And I'm thinking, Birmingham? What's Birmingham doing in foreign affairs papers? I open them up, and it's all about this campaign, the civil rights campaign in Birmingham, Alabama. So I'm like, what's that doing? So I start looking at these things, and they're all telegrams and letters from all over the country pouring into the president's desk, complaining about this and how this is affecting America's image. And I want to show you just 3 of them that are representative, but I want you to magnify this. Imagine John F. Kennedy getting these, right? All at once, hundreds of these. So let's read a couple of them. And I'm just going to show you highlights of them. You guys can read the whole document on Canvas. So the first one is actually from one of those newly independent nations in Africa that had freed itself from colonialism. This was Uganda. So this is the first prime minister of Uganda. And he's sending a letter to Kennedy, and it says this: "Nothing is more paradoxical than that these events should take place in the United States and at a time when that country is anxious to project its image before the world screen as the archetype of democracy and the champion of freedom. We in Africa, who have borne the white man's burden for decades and centuries, who have fought for and attained the self-same rights that African Americans are now striving for, feel that our own freedom and independence would be a mere sham if our black brethren elsewhere in Africa and in the United States still remain in political, social, and economic bondage. Mr. President, the eyes and ears of the world are concentrated on events in Alabama, and it is the duty of the free world, and more so of the countries that hold themselves up as the leaders of the free world, to see that all of their citizens, regardless of the color of their skin, are free." Boy, was Wallace wrong. Okay? Let me show you another one. Hundreds of these. Telegram from our closest ally, Great Britain. So this is from some of the citizens of Great Britain. Again, you can read the whole thing. I'm just going to show you part, just the start part here. Quote, We abhor and condemn the mockery of democracy in which unarmed and barehanded U.S. Negro citizens are subjected to the most brutal atrocities by government authorities in the different states. The shameless and brazen use against Negroes of police dogs, fire hoses, wholesale arrests, and mass jailings and murder has exposed the lie that the United States stands for human dignity and freedom. Ouch. Let me show you another one. And this one may be one of the most influential. This one is from the Parliament of Australia. So this is their legislature. And this was important because we were using Australian naval bases as our staging area for Vietnam, okay? So they're going to reference those and see if you can hear the kind of veiled threat in here, okay? Parliament. We, the undersigned Australian members of Parliament, appeal your urgent intervention to halt acts of barbarism against Negro people in Birmingham, Alabama, at a time when Australia is giving unprecedented welcome to U.S. naval force. Right. Birmingham incidents defame American claim as defenders of justice and liberty. As elected representatives of the Australian people, we feel that the anti-racial activities now occurring would be contrary to your principles of democracy and Christian justice. Do you hear the little threat there? Yeah, yeah. So if you want to hold on to those naval bases, you got to clean up your act, America. And let's be honest, Great Britain and Australia were not squeaky clean on race either. Not by a long shot. But they're not the team captain of the free world. America is proclaiming itself as the team captain of the free world. And if we don't walk our talk, we make the whole team look bad and are compromised, right? So they're saying, buck up, team captain. If you can't do it, get out of the way. Maybe someone else can.
Well, they might not be are they even close to doing these kind of things?
To mixed extents. They didn't have as large a black populations, but no, they weren't doing great either, particularly on, like, for Australia, indigenous rights and so on. Yeah, this is an image thing, right? So this isn't a battle, in the Cold War. But yeah, that no one's squeaky clean. But America was proclaiming itself as being kind of almost perfect when you come out of the McCarthy period, right? That we were stamping down all kinds of criticism. That's why the civil rights movement was being red-baited. It's like, we don't want to see any of it. So this is hitting America's image hard. But your point is really well taken, because you're correct. Okay, so it's no coincidence, gang, that a matter of weeks after this happens, the Birmingham campaign, that John F. Kennedy puts forth the Civil Rights Bill in Congress. And he says it's a moral issue to pass. So he puts this in June of '63. And this is a big moment, because remember Kennedy? He barely got elected president, and he's walking a political fence. He wants to keep the Dixiecrats in his party happy because they're the muscle on his party, but he also wants to keep the civil rights sections of his party happy, so he's doing favors to both, and he's walking this fence. And King is trying to use events to push him off that fence and commit to civil rights. And this did it. This did it, okay? So now the South, they're feeling a bit abandoned by their own party, and that's going to become significant, okay? All right. So this bill goes into Congress. It's going to be filibustered for a year. So it gets put into, Kennedy gives his speech in June. This is August 1963, and this is the big March on Washington that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, right? A. Philip Randolph was the president of this march, by the way, okay? This is a huge victory. It's one of the largest, most peaceful marches ever in American history in the nation's capital at this point. And it was for jobs and freedom. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was designed to get rid of job discrimination and public accommodation discrimination. So this is for jobs and freedom, all right? And then after that, let's come down here a little bit. Well, let's take a look at how people were perceiving King at this point. Let's do a check-in of public opinion. In April, when he's doing his Birmingham campaign, people were asked, is he moving too fast? Is he moving at the right speed or not fast enough? 71% of the American population said he's moving at about the right speed. So what he's doing in Birmingham is popular. But then people were asked how they feel about the March on Washington that's being planned in August. And fully 60% of people are ambivalent about that. They're not sure if it's going to be violent or not. All these black people, particularly amassing in the nation's capital, there's more caution about that. All right? So 60% are against that. They like King, particularly when he's down in the South, but if he comes to DC with a march, ambivalence on that. Not so sure. Okay? All right. John F. Kennedy gets killed in November of 63. And now Lyndon Johnson goes from the 2 spot to the 1 spot. And Confederates who hated Kennedy are now just cheering. They're waving Confederate flags and they're saying, we got one of our own guys in there, right? We got a good Texan in there. He'll kill this bill. He's one of us. Oh, was he? How did Johnson feel about the Civil Rights Bill? Because he has people around him saying, you don't want to touch this because this is pretty controversial, particularly in the South, right? Did he support civil rights, the bill, or not? Give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, because this was in Meacham. Thumbs up if you support. Okay. And how much support? Okay, good. Yeah, he was hugely supportive, right? He was warned, you don't want to touch this bill. The very first speech he makes, this is where he's taking the oath of office. There's Jackie still in her blood-stained jacket. This is Air Force One. He takes the oath. One of his first speeches, he says, let's pass this civil rights bill for our martyred president. Let's do it for him. He's going to marshal the grief of the country, which was huge, toward the bill. And when people are saying, what in the hell are you doing, man? What did he say about the presidency? Yeah, that's it. What's the presidency for? If not to do something big, right? So he's saying this, I'm ready to risk the presidency on this. What in the hell is it for? I think is the way Johnson put it. Yeah. Okay, very good. And so he is going to work to get this bill passed, and we'll talk about that in a minute. How did most Americans feel about this bill? Well, you know, I like to squeak in Idaho history, right? I've actually looked at all the constituent mail that Senator Frank Church, that represented our region of Idaho, all of his constituent mail is in our library. I've read it all. And he got lots of letters with respect to the Civil Rights Bill. I also looked at all the constituent mail of Representative Compton White, who represented northern Idaho. Frank Church said at one point that his mail was running 10-1 against the bill. I did my own poll of his mail, and I would put it more at 7-1. But it was about 70% against the bill. That Idahoans did not want government telling them who they should hire or what kind of spaces, people should get into certain spaces and so on. So they were roundly against it. This is an example of one of those pieces of mail. And I also found all these groups that came out officially in Idaho against the Civil Rights Bill. And if you look at them, a lot of them are connected to business. The Farm Bureau, several chambers of commerce, the Sun Valley Business and Women's Professional Club. I thought it was interesting, the Idaho Women's Christian Temperance Union came out officially against the bill, okay? But a lot of business connected, because I think businesses are thinking that their customers, their white customers, don't want to go for it. And so they're protecting, right, their business interests there. In spite of that, gang, all 4 of Idaho's delegation in Congress, our senators and our congressmen, all of them voted in favor of the bill because they were listening to the debates in Congress. They knew it was a national issue. And so they stepped up in that moment. They kind of risked themselves a little bit to vote in favor of the bill. And it was a bipartisan delegation, by the way, okay? So the bill does pass. It takes about a year. Lyndon Johnson, you guys read about it in Meacham. He pulls together a bipartisan group of folks because they have to break the Southern filibuster. You can't just do that with Northern Democrat votes. So he got a lot of Republicans of goodwill who were supporting civil rights that were largely from the Midwest, combined with Northern Democrats that were in favor of the bill, and they got it released from the clutches of the filibuster, and they got it passed. And this is the law. This is the federal government is finally, after 100 years, going to enforce part of the heart of the 14th Amendment. Okay? So it outlaws discrimination in accommodations and employment. And this is interesting. It ends the all deliberate speed part of Brown versus Board of Education, which had given the South kind of the almost invitation to use massive resistance, because deliberative meant go only as fast as you can go safely for kids. Okay? So massive resistance always makes it unsafe. So this gets rid of that, because it was getting embarrassing for America to go all this time, 11 years, and not to have this bill enforced. So they finally say, you've got to do it. Okay? It does not deal with voting or fair housing rights. So that has yet to be dealt with. Let's look at how the nation was looking at the bill. Ambivalence again, gang. And the ambivalence is important for what's going to happen with respect to King's success later. That's why we're looking at this. So when the law was passed, and this is everybody, this is black and white people, all people in America, almost 60% approve of the bill when it's originally passed. But then when they're asked, how strongly do you want it enforced? Because remember, enforcement's the second half. You can have a law like the 14th and 15th Amendment, but if it's not enforced, it's a paper tiger, right? So how do they feel about enforcement? Almost 70% said, enforce it moderately. They were asked, do you want vigorous enforcement or moderate enforcement? 70% said moderate enforcement. So don't enforce it too hard. We like it, but light touch, please. That's interesting. That's interesting, okay? Ambivalence. All right. Now, this is even more interesting. More clues here of what's going to blow up on King a little bit. When the bill was passed, that part about the schools, and what the Civil Rights Bill says is that finally the federal government is going to force the schools of the South to desegregate, okay? No more messing around. You got to do it. But they added a loophole for how Northerners do segregation. The North does it through more de facto rather than de jure. They do it through housing, and I'll show you more about that in a minute. So they add a clause in here. This is the real language in the bill, where they're defining what segregation and desegregation mean. I'll just paraphrase it for you. What they basically said is, for purposes of segregation, what we mean by segregation for desegregating the schools, we mean places that have segregated through law, through de jure. But segregation, or they prefer to call it racial imbalances, that's the word they use in the bill. Schools that are racially imbalanced but are not done through law, if it's done through housing, that does not qualify for a segregated environment, meaning it stands outside the bill. And what it gave was a loophole that both the Republican and Democratic Northern Civil Rights Coalition agreed to, so that Northern schools can continue to keep segregated schools as long as it's done through de facto methods like housing. Interesting. And the Southerners picked this up. They're like going, hey, you're going to make us desegregate, but you're not going to desegregate your own areas? What's with that? Look at what Mississippi Senator James Eastland said about that. He's upset about that. He says this, quote, "It appears that the draftsmen of the Dirksen-Mansfield substitute," that's the loophole, are so zealous as to protect the states of New York, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Missouri, and California, where de facto segregation is now such an important factor in life, that they go so far as to deny the court itself the power to enlarge its existing decisions regarding the achievement of racial imbalance. Meaning, you're taking the ability of the court to define what segregation and racial imbalance mean, and you're defining it in a way that protects your own region. He says, that's not fair. But then the North is going to kind of go wink, wink, nod, nod. Hey, but South, if you want to keep segregating your schools, we've just created a method for you too if you want to. Interesting. Okay, let's keep going.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Now, voting hadn't been dealt with yet. And King goes to Johnson and says, you didn't put voting in this bill. It had been stripped out. You didn't put voting in this bill. We have to have the vote to be able to be free citizens in America. And Johnson says, man, we can't get two big things like this, both the civil rights and the voting rights, through this quickly. King says, but we need it. And so Johnson says, well, then get out there and use your winning strategy and create the grassroots pressure on the politicians to make me do it. He says, go make me do it, okay? Get out there with your winning strategy, do it again. So he goes to Selma, right? You guys read about this in our Meacham chapter, right? So this is Selma, and it's just the same thing that happened in Birmingham. You just have different characters, but it's the same strategy, right? So you guys read about this young guy. See the young guy on the right in the light tan coat? That's John Lewis. He's your age, okay? He's leading this march. Meacham talked a lot about him. They're going to try to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge on a march to Montgomery for voting rights. And instead of Bull Connor, you've got Sheriff Jim Clark saying, go back home. We're not going to let you march. Okay? And when they begin to march, you can then see what happens. You guys read about it, right? Instead of the police dogs and fire hoses, you've got a lot of troopers. They've got their gas masks already on, so they already know what they're going to do, right? They start throwing gas, right? And then as the people are gassed and they can't see and they can't hardly breathe, a lot of them were on horseback, are just beating people over the head with their billy clubs. And here's John Lewis getting beat with that stick, and it breaks his skull. It cracks right through the cranium, okay? And this gets all caught on camera. And that has the same effect as Birmingham does. All of a sudden, white people are coming down from the north to help finish the march. Martin Luther King says, we're going to Montgomery, we're gonna finish the march. Johnson promises protection this time, right? And so you've got all that support, and here they are. Here's King and company. Now they're successfully marching across the bridge, and that builds up with the winning strategy. Political support for Johnson to then sign the Voting Rights Act. And there's King right there, okay? All right, victories. Pig pile strategy worked. Media is with him, got Northern white allies with him, and he's put pressure on the president to protect America's image, right? And they got those two big pieces of legislation. Now the 15th Amendment, the heart of it, and the 19th Amendment for black women is finally going to be enforced by the federal government. Okay. But then 2 weeks later, a neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles called Watts, which was horribly segregated, full of job discrimination, housing discrimination, school discrimination, it explodes. In the first of the big summer uprisings of African Americans. This was the first big one. There had been small ones before, but Watts is the first big one. It happens 2 weeks after Selma. And then every summer after that, you've got different black neighborhoods in northern places that are exploding. And this one started like most of them did. It was a police officer who, they didn't teach policemen back then to do community policing, sensitivity policing. They tended to police black areas at the point of a billy club. And so you had an instance of police brutality, and it was the spark, okay? So you get burning and destruction in the city, people getting killed by the police, and right? And King he's just distraught because he goes to Watts. Here he is in Watts. This is Watts too. And he said, he has a message for the people of Watts, and he has a message for the people of America. He says to the people of Watts, don't do the uprisings. I get it. You're in pain. The civil rights movement of the South hasn't reached your area yet. I know it hasn't. We've had 11 years of civil rights from Brown to the Voting Rights Act. It hasn't taken one rat out of one kid's crib in Watts. It hasn't put any food on the table or made jobs better for people outside of the South. I get it. You're in pain. We've been ignoring you. But this is just giving those ambivalent white people an excuse to pull against the movement. He could already tell that there were white people that wanted to pull against the movement, okay? So let me bring my recipe to you. I have a good way of doing it. Don't do uprisings, do it my way. And then he goes to the rest of the country and he says, don't see this as a violation of law and order. It's not. These are just people who are in existential pain. He called it, quote, the desperate cries of the unheard. These are poor people in the inner city. They don't know how to get their message out. I know this isn't a productive way of doing it, but recognize these are people in existential pain. We need to go in with help, but don't go in with guns blazing, okay? He wants a GI Bill for the poor and said, okay, all right. Now, he comes to Chicago. He said, I'm gonna bring my strategy up to the north, show you how I do it, okay? Winning strategy. Goes up to Chicago the very next year. Chicago was a deeply segregated city. It was a democratic city, but deeply segregated, and particularly with respect to housing, but then everything else. And he's bringing his recipe. So he's bringing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his group, to do nonviolent civil disobedience where they're marching peacefully through white neighborhoods and basically trying to say to the North, you know, I know North, you've got your Civil War innocence narrative, but there's segregation here too. And we need to get that out in the open so that we can deal with it, right? And so he starts marching. There he is, and he has other religious leaders in Chicago, nuns and priests and rabbis marching with him. And this is the crowd coming out in Chicago. You can see signs, keep white neighborhoods white, white men organize white guard, okay? And this all got caught on television too. King wants to expose it. Hey, it's up here too. It's a national problem. I want to give you eyes on again. You need to see it with your own eyes, okay? Because this did get on the national media. So let's take a look. How does it play in Chicago? So let's watch. And this is also from Eyes on the Prize, like the first one was. Okay. This is Chicago. And remember, this is Martin Luther King's group. Here we go.
This neighborhood was convinced that we were there to take away their most precious possession, their homes, and the beauty of their neighborhood. And as we walked deeper and deeper into the neighborhood, you had a great sense of isolation. Would I ever get out of here? And the expressions of anger and hate, the swastikas which were held up, just unbelievable. And it showed the problem. After all, the point was to show the problem, to show the fear, to show the rejection, to show the hate, to show the problem that we were trying to solve.
And it was said that you could not expose segregation in the North because it was subtle. The fact is, it was everything except subtle. It was dynamic, it was real, blatant, ugly, violent.
So I was hit 3 times. Were any of your other people hit? I don't know. How many of your people were arrested? I don't know.
Three days of marching exposed white resistance and heightened black skepticism about the use of nonviolence.
We sent Negroes in large numbers to the real estate offices in Gage Park. Every time Negroes went in, the real estate agent said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have anything listed." Now you can find something somewhere else, and it was always back in the ghetto, but they didn't have anything. And then soon after that, we sent some of our fine white staff members into those same real estate offices, and the minute the white persons got in, they opened the book. "Oh yes, well, we have several things. Now, what exactly do you want?"
On August 5th, the marchers returned to the southwest side. Mayor Daley had sent 1,200 police officers. They estimated the mob at 5,000.
There was just a rain of rocks and cherry bombs. So you didn't know what it was.
The Martin Luther King was struck on the head, and I remember the reaction everybody had. they all, surged forward, and the march was stopped. Everyone said, halt, wait, and I remember Jesse Jackson running in because he was right near Martin Luther King, and they held Martin Luther King's head down.
Okay. Could you guys see the Confederate flags in there? I know the image is a little bit more distant to you. Yeah. There were a lot of Confederate flags and swastikas and so on. But this was King's point. He just wanted to show this was a national problem, right? And he's got the video footage, okay? Now we need to see if this works the same way here as it did in other places. But let's talk a little bit more about how de facto segregation works. What I've found in my own research, and I think most scholars have, is in the North, Northern whites hung on to housing segregation like bulldogs with pork chops because it was the center of how you do de facto segregation. Let me show you. If you can segregate the housing, and King, when he was talking about going into the real estate offices, he's talking about a strategy called realtor steering, where realtors would steer white people towards some houses and black people toward others. The banking industry also wouldn't give loans certain places. There's all these mechanisms for doing segregation. If you can segregate housing, gang, you can gerrymander your school districts. You don't have to have a law that says that schools are segregated. You can just gerrymander them in a particular way, right? If you can segregate the housing, you can do job discrimination because you have to put an address on your job application. And if they see an address coming from a neighborhood that is largely African American, then they can assume you might not be white. You can gerrymander voting districts. You can do different kinds of policing in different neighborhoods. You can zone neighborhoods differently, and that means city services are going to be channeled towards some places and away from others, all those kinds of things. So this is sort of the spider web, if you will, the complex way of how de jure happened. And so when you see white people hanging on to the housing, they know it connects to a lot of different things. So they also know, we talked about redlining in here. If black people move into a white neighborhood, and this isn't the fault of black people, it's the system, but if black people move into a neighborhood and there's enough of them, a neighborhood can go from being green-lined or blue-lined, where you can get mortgage loans and so on, to being yellow-lined or red-lined, which means you're not going to get the favorable loans. That was done on race. And so white people are concerned, if black people come into my neighborhood, it could hit my housing values and so on. So there's economics all tied into this, but this is part of the system, right? It's not a part of the people, it's a part of the system. It has nothing to do with black people, right? Okay, so housing covenants was also the way that they did housing segregation. This is the one I showed you a few weeks ago in Idaho, on Idaho Day. This was how ours was phrased, right? No person of any race other than the white race shall occupy or use any buildings or parcel, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancies by domestic servants of a different race, domiciled with the owner or tenant. That was how it was phrased in the Boise area, but these were used too, right? So housing covenants in titles of homes or in subdivisions, and this is Boise. These tactics, very effective in segregating the black dots for the black families, right? And that's where black people were allowed to live in Boise. So, and then you can gerrymander it, right? You can send all those folks to one particular school, okay? And fair housing, the Fair Housing Act of '68 is going to outlaw those covenants, but it's not necessarily going to outlaw the other stuff, the other tactics. And when the Fair Housing Act was up for debate in the spring of '68, the realtors, the realtor business was overwhelmingly against open housing, overwhelmingly against desegregation because they thought their clients wouldn't like it, right? This is an ad from the Idaho Statesman where the Boise Board of Realtors is lobbying against the Fair Housing Act. So it's all over the North, right? Idaho too. Okay. Now, how does this affect how people feel about the civil rights movement? So, gang, this is, and also how the media portrays it. How does the national media, what are they going to do with that footage? So this is a very recognizable guy if you grew up when I was young. This is Mike Wallace of CBS. CBS was the big news channel back then. Walter Cronkite was the anchor, and he was part of 60 Minutes. So he does sort of the long-form journalism. So he actually, I'll give you this video clip on Canvas so you can see it. We don't have time to watch it today. But he actually did like a 60-minute show where Mike Wallace went into the neighborhood that threw the rocks at Martin Luther King, the Chicago neighborhood. And he went around and he interviewed the wives and mothers of the people, the young men that were out there saying, kill King and so on. And he actually started talking to these wives and mothers, and he brings empathy to them, where they're just saying, we're just afraid of our housing values. We've worked all our lives. This is working class whites. We've worked all our lives for this little house and to keep our neighborhood nice and to keep it safe. And if Black people come in, we're not sure if they live like us, but we don't want our housing values to go down. This is going to affect our American dream. They didn't do those kind of interviews with Confederates in the South, but they're doing that with the white neighborhoods. And a lot of Northern whites would have empathized with that. Yeah, if Black people move into the neighborhood, the way the system works, it might lower our housing values, blah, 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 right? The other thing that Mike Wallace did when he went into this neighborhood, and I'll give you the clip, when he's talking about the Black people coming in to do the desegregation, he calls them militants. That's King. It's Martin Luther King's group, and they're calling him a militant, an outsider. They didn't label him that way when he was in the South. So all of a sudden, King, gang, is losing the positive good guys, bad guys framing that he needs from the national media when he goes to the North. He's losing the media coverage. Now, okay, this is Mike Wallace interviewing Lewis Harris of the Harris polls. You got Gallup polls and Harris polls. And Harris is talking about, after Chicago, how people in the country are feeling now about the civil rights movement. And in this clip, and I can give this to you too, he says 78% of Black people do want open housing, which just means desegregating housing. Everybody has the same shot to buy the same houses, move where they want to move, right, if you've got the money to do it. But 70% of white working class people were opposed to it because of the reasons that I've said. Okay? So all of a sudden, you've got the white working class pulling away from African Americans, and at the same time, pulling away from the Democratic Party. A lot of poor working class whites were part of the Democratic Party because of unions. Democratic Party was the party of unions back then. But when they see, and this is from their perspective, we're gonna step into the shoes of the white working class. From their perspective, what they saw were Northern liberal Democratic politicians like Edward Kennedy and so on, who are rich or middle class. They felt like that these elite liberal Democratic politicians are throwing the white working class neighborhoods under the bus in the sense that they are on the front lines of desegregation. African American neighborhood usually abutted a white working class neighborhood. So Black people are going to integrate into the white working class neighborhood. But it's unlikely they're going to integrate into the middle class neighborhood or the wealthy neighborhood. So they felt like our Democratic politicians who are rich, it's not their kids' schools that are going to be integrated. It's not their neighborhoods that are going to be integrated. It's ours. And so you start to see the white working class beginning to get angry at the Democratic Party. Okay? All right. We're going to pick up on that when we do politics. Now, polls. So this is one of the polls that Lewis Harris did. And you can track white liberal support pulling away from the civil rights movement. In June '63, which is when the Civil Rights Act was getting put into Congress, white liberal support, and we're talking about liberals here, white liberal support for civil rights, very positive, 64%. When King begins his Chicago campaign, right at the beginning of the summer, it's already dropped to 42 because now King's, quote, invading the North. By the time that this campaign is over, white liberal support has dropped to 27%. It's just tanked, okay? Liberal non-support of the movement is up to 73. So the Chicago campaign alienated white liberals who had been the most favorable toward the civil rights movement because he's up in the North and he's going after housing, okay? Interesting, interesting. By the time Martin Luther King is killed in April of '68, 75% of Americans disapproved of him. They had a negative opinion of him. So he goes from Time Magazine Man of the Year, Nobel Prize winner in '64. 3 years later, only about a quarter of all Americans approve of him. And even 60% of African Americans felt like his strategy was failing because Chicago was a failed campaign with the exception of Jesse Jackson's. He had a boycott called Operation Breadbasket, that worked. But the housing desegregation campaign didn't work. And the Democratic establishment and the media kind of pulled against him. So King is floundering. He's like, what do I do? His strategy has kind of faltered, okay? And even African Americans are saying, we're not sure if what you're doing is working anymore. Now, here's what he's lost with his recipe, gang. He's lost a friendly national media. He had friendly media when he was in the South. The northern media is friendly to him when he's in the South, but when they come up to where that national media has its constituency, the national media isn't as friendly. They don't paint his group as necessarily the good guys in the story. The president at this point, Lyndon Johnson, he feels like he's fixed the problem because he's fixed the egregious South. The South was the one that had the bad images in the eyes of the world. Plus, Johnson by this point is off to Vietnam. You know, he's focused on that. But the president isn't really focused on the North as much. He lost Northern white allies. So he doesn't have Northerners that are going to cut checks for him. There were a lot of people in Chicago that would cut him a check when he was in the South. But when he comes into their area, not so friendly toward him anymore. And then the legislative stuff, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, again, those were more focused on the South in many respects, particularly, like I said, the schooling part. So he's lost his levers. Now, what's he going to do, right? At the end of his life, he's trying to figure out how to make change. This happens sometimes when you're doing social change. Sometimes you have a window that opens for strategy, and then it closes. So here's what he was trying at the end of his life. He was planning the Poor People's Campaign. And this, he didn't get to pull it off. He gets killed in April of '68. This was planned for the summer of '68. His family, Coretta, his wife, and his lieutenants kind of carried it on, but it just fizzled without him in the same way. But here's what his plan was, gang. This is where he was going, a new strategy. You can think about whether you think this would have worked or not. We won't know because he's killed, but see what you think of this. Okay, this is what he was going to try. You can't pigpile on the South anymore. You've got to actually, it's a national problem. So you've got to actually pigpile on the whole country at this point. So he was trying two things. You can see the white working class pulling away from the black community within the Democratic Party. He wants to pull the poor people back together. So he starts this Poor People's Campaign that isn't about race. It's just about, do you have access to the American dream or not? So he wanted to pull together poor white people, poor Latinos, indigenous populations, black people, anybody that was left out. And he's pitching something called the GI Bill for the Poor, which is just like the GI Bill we talked about a few weeks ago, where it's just better access to education, jobs, and housing. That's it. Let's just include those people, right? That was his plan. So you're trying to build a broader coalition, so it's not just about race. And then he's going to do you remember the bonus march we talked about after World War I, when all these World War I veterans that were hungry came and camped out in 1932 on the nation's capital? Yeah, asking for their bonus because they were starving. King is going to do that. He's going to bring poor people of all different races to the nation's capital. And they're going to camp out so that people can see their faces, so they can see that poverty it's got a human face on it, okay? They're going to camp out in D.C. Then the media can't ignore them, hopefully. Congress can't ignore them. But the other thing is in Washington, D.C., you've got all the embassies of all the nations in the world. And you've got their media. So you've got the BBC, for example. You know, you got the British Embassy. You don't have to depend on the northern media to carry your story. You can reach the international people directly, okay, with their own media. So that's what he was going to try. But like I said, he's killed. He's assassinated. Now let's bring another person in here. Malcolm X. Malcolm X was from the North, and he predicted. He actually gets killed 3 years before Martin Luther King. Malcolm X was killed in February of '65, but he's from the North, and he predicted that this would happen to King. He always used to say that segregationists in the South were like wolves. If they bare their teeth and growl at you, you know they want to eat you. But segregation in the North are kind of like foxes. They bare their teeth and growl at you. They kind of look like they're smiling, but they want to eat you too, that they'll turn on you. So he kind of understood that King would have probably got rejected if he comes up into the North, because he's from there. Let's look at what Malcolm X was going to try. Malcolm X, let me tell you just a little bit about him. We can talk more about him when we come back. Malcolm X was born in the North, poor, to a family of 9 kids. His father was a Garveyite, Marcus Garvey follower of Black nationalism. He fell in with the Nation of Islam at first as a young man. He was recruited out of prison. And the Nation of Islam was kind of an offshoot racist cult of Orthodox Islam. Orthodox Islam does not recognize this group. They basically said that white people are innate devils. And he believed that at first because of how he had been treated. But he left that group in mid-'63. He found hypocrisy in it. He had become one of their best speakers. He found hypocrisy in the group. And then he also wanted to become more political. He then left the group and became an Orthodox Muslim. He became a Sunni. And he went on the Hajj to Mecca, where he met blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims that treated him like a full human being, treated him with all dignity and respect. And that just kind of washed a lot of the racism out of him, that he thought white people are not innately anything. They can be, you know, like anybody, but it's other things. It's either economic interests or status or something that pulls them into seeing segregation as part of their interest, but they don't have to be that way. In 1964, Malcolm X became the second most popular speaker on college campuses around the country because he saw great hope in white young people, that college-age folks also were dreaming a different kind of dream, a more inclusive dream. So he was a very popular speaker. I think Barry Goldwater, I think, was the most popular speaker. Okay, so he's reaching out. And then in '64, he starts reaching out to Martin Luther King. And he says to Martin Luther King, let's talk. You know stuff about the South. I know stuff about the North. You know, we both want an answer to this problem. Let's collaborate. So he's reaching out, kind of spreading his wings and building a broader coalition. And at the end of his life, because he's really facing the same problem as King is, how do you crack the North? How do you crack the entire country? Here was X's plan at the end of his life. So he also knows that you have to bring pressure on the entire country. So he created, in the last 18 months of his life, because he's only alive 18 months after he leaves the Nation of Islam, he creates a group called the Organization for Afro-American Unity, which is the acronym up there, the OAAU, which was it's a black nationalism, because he says white people don't really want to share with us yet, so black people have to bond together. It's African Americans bonding with Africans who had freed themselves from colonialism and working collaboratively across the pond to try to fight for the rights of people of color. And their plan was, this was his hope anyway, how are you going to bring pressure, international pressure on the country? They were going to bring a charge in the General Assembly of the United Nations. Remember, the General Assembly of the United Nations had human rights built into its mission statement. So they were going to bring a charge through the General Assembly against American discrimination. Just like in the United Nations, there had been charges brought against Rhodesia and South Africa for apartheid. Well, America is violating those things too. And if we're going to walk our talk and we're going to condemn those countries, then we need to fix it in our own country. So he's trying to build United Nations pressure, and maybe even the World Court. So let me show you a little clip of him, just so you can, again, put your own ears and your own eyes on it, so you don't have to believe me. Hear Malcolm X talking about this.
I had one. Then realizing that our problem in America, that we are black Americans and we have a problem that goes beyond religion, we formed a group known as the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And the objective of this organization, it's non-religious, number one. Any Negro can belong to it. And the objective of that organization is to bring about a condition that will guarantee respect and recognition of the 22 million black Americans as human beings. We feel that the problem, number one, of the black man in America is beyond America's ability to solve. It's a human problem, not an American problem or a Negro problem. And as a human problem or a world problem, we feel that it should be taken out of the jurisdiction of the United States government and the United States courts and taken into the United Nations in the same manner that the problems of the black man in South Africa, Angola, and other parts of the world, and even the way they're trying to bring the problems of the Jews in Russia into the United Nations because of violation of human rights. We believe that our problem is one not of violation of civil rights, but a violation of human rights. Not only are we denied the right to be a citizen in the United States, we're denied the right to be a human being.
Mr. X, may I thank you very much for coming on our program and perhaps...
All right. So these two, gang, and they did actually meet once. They were down, I don't know if this is where this was Selma, but they both actually were down in Selma. In the Selma campaign for voting rights, Malcolm X was invited down by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I'll give you guys this clip as well. It's really cool because X is actually trying to almost play good cop, bad cop to help Martin Luther King. He's down in Selma for the voting rights campaign. And he says to the people of the South, this is Malcolm X, he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, you people in this part of the world, in the South, you do well to listen to Dr. Martin Luther King and give him what he's asking for and give it to him fast. That's the ballot. That's right to do. And if you don't give it to him the way he's asking nice, it's going to be gotten one way or the other. There are others of us that'll do it another way. And then when he left the podium, I hope I'm not mistaken on this, but I believe Coretta was in the audience. I don't think King was. He leans over and says, I'm trying to help your husband. If they're afraid of me as the militant, don't want to talk to you as the moderate. Kind of like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt. You know, you got Alice Paul sort of as the more militant, and Carrie Chapman Catt, who then can work on the inside-outside baseball. We've talked about that before. That he was trying actually to help King at the end of his life. So these guys were both killed at the age of 39. And they were both searching for a way to continue to make change. But they both hit the same block, right? How do you deal with the North, which is sort of the muscle on things, when they don't want to change, right? They were okay changing the South because that's what was embarrassing the country in the eyes of the world. But once that's tackled, how far is the country as a nation going to go? And then you've got Northern white voters that had been part of the Democratic Party are starting to pull away there. And that will get us into some politics in coming weeks. We have a minute left. What questions or comments or insights do you want to add before we go? Don't pack up yet. Do you think one of these strategies or the other would have worked or not? That's something else to think about. Okay.
To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.